Benita Randle, U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Keep your hands where I can see them.
I just arrived at work. What is happening?
Benita Randle's co-defendant agreed to cooperate with investigators months ago. She has no idea she's walking into a room full of recovered checks with her name written all over them.
$69,000 in stolen checks diverted from 89 pieces of mail at the processing center.
I am a supervisor.
Stolen checks were recovered from a repossessed car.
The investigation that had just landed at her door did not start inside a post office. It started inside a repossessed car. 89 checks. $369,248 in face value. Every one of them lifted from a mail stream she had spent 2 decades swearing to protect. The federal agent standing in her supervisor's office had a folder with her badge access logs, a name to put on the indictment alongside hers, and a single piece of evidence neither of them could have planned for: a tow truck driver, an unpaid car loan, and a stack of other people's checks sitting in the glove box of a sedan that had been hauled away at 4 a.m. over a delinquent note. Pay attention to the dollar amount in this case. Now think about how long it took someone to notice. Drop your guess in the comments below. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button. We break down how these schemes actually work every single week, and we go places mainstream coverage will not. Benita Marcelle Randle was born on May the 11th, 1980, at St. Mary's Health Center in Richmond Heights, the middle of 3 children. Her mother, Erlene Randle, worked as a nurse's aide at Barnes Jewish Hospital, pulling night shifts in the cardiac ward for 31 years before retiring in 2014. Her father, Curtis Randle, drove a city sanitation truck on the north side of St. Louis, a Packer route that took him through the streets of Walnut Park, Penrose, and Hyde Park 3 mornings a week. He held that job for 26 years until a herniated disc and 2 failed back surgeries ended his career in 2002. The family lived in a modest brick 2-story on Carter Avenue, 3 blocks east of Goodfellow, in a part of North St. Louis where the porches were close enough to the street that the entire block knew who came and who went. Benita's older brother, Curtis Jr., joined the Navy out of high school and shipped out to Norfolk before she finished 8th grade. Her younger sister, Tameka, became a hairstylist with a chair at a salon on West Florissant. Benita was the steady middle child, the one who finished her homework before her mother had to ask, the one who walked her sister the 4 blocks to elementary school every morning, the one who handed her father his coffee thermos in the dark of the kitchen before he left for the route. She graduated from Sumner High School in 1998. The yearbook entry under her name listed her activities as the National Honor Society, the Office Aid Program, and the Student Council Attendance Committee. Her senior superlative, voted by her homeroom, was most reliable. She enrolled at Forest Park Community College the following fall, taking general education courses with the vague intent of transferring to a 4-year university for a business degree. The transfer did not happen. By her 2nd semester, she was working 2 part-time jobs, a cashier shift at the Schnucks on Page Avenue, and a weekend front desk shift at a chain motel near Lambert Field. And the coursework began slipping past her in increments she did not realize were permanent until the next registration period had already closed. In the spring of 2001, she walked into the federal building on Market Street and filled out a Postal Service application. She was 20 years old. The federal hiring exam, at the time still known as the 473, was administered 3 weeks later in a basement testing room, 2 floors below ground. She scored in the upper percentile. By August of that year, she had been sworn in as a mail handler at the St. Louis Processing and Distribution Center on Eddy and Park Road, a 30-acre facility in the southern part of the city that handled the mail for the entire 630 zip code area and several adjacent counties. Her starting wage was $12.41 an hour. She worked the third shift, 11 p.m. to 7:30 a.m., pulling tubs of letter mail off conveyors, dumping them into the feed hoppers of the delivery bar code sorters, and clearing jams when the machines stalled. The work was physical, repetitive, and loud. The processing floor was the size of a city block and held more than 40 automated sorting machines, each of them capable of processing 35,000 pieces of mail per hour. The noise on the floor was a constant, rhythmic, mechanical roar that did not stop until the dispatch trucks pulled away for the carrier routes just after dawn. She did the work without complaint. Her early evaluations described her as punctual, dependable, and able to follow process without requiring repeated instruction. In 2004, she bid into a clerk position, which moved her off the heavy lift work and on to the manual sortation cases, the standing desks where mail too irregular for the machines was sorted by hand. The work was easier on her back. The pay was $1.90 an hour higher. The position also moved her, for the first time, into proximity with the parts of the mail stream that did not look like the rest of it. Registered mail, certified mail, oversized business envelopes that ran through hand sortation because the machines could not read them. She married Devin Henderson in the summer of 2006 at a small ceremony in Fairground Park, with her father walking her down a paved path between the pavilions because the church wedding her mother had hoped for could not be afforded. Their daughter Imani was born the following spring. The marriage lasted 4 years. Henderson moved out in 2010, and the divorce was finalized a year after that. Benita kept the house, a 3-bedroom bungalow on Wabata Avenue that she had bought with a first-time buyer loan 2 years into the marriage, and the primary custody of Imani. She took the supervisor exam in 2012. She passed on the first attempt. By 2015, she had a 204 supervisory detail, a temporary supervisor assignment used to evaluate candidates, and by 2017, she was a permanent EAS 17 supervisor of distribution operations at the same facility she had walked into 17 years earlier as a mail handler. Her base salary was $68,000 a year. With the night shift differential, the Sunday premium, and the regular overtime that came with running short-staffed shifts, her gross income in 2022 crossed $84,000 for the first time. Her evaluations across that decade were consistently positive. One reviewer wrote that Randle manages the floor calmly and without escalation, even on the heaviest volume nights. Another wrote that she knows the equipment, knows the routes, and knows her people, the kind of supervisor a new clerk is lucky to be assigned to. A third, written by the plant manager in 2021, observed that Benita has the institutional memory of someone who has worked every position on this floor, because she has. She was, by every metric the Postal Service used to measure its supervisors, exactly the kind of employee the agency was built to produce. 22 years on, steady, trusted, unflashy. A North Side single mother who had walked into the building at 20 and never left, who had bought a small house on a quiet street and raised her daughter inside it, and who in the file room of the Human Resources Office had a personnel jacket that ran almost 2 inches thick, without a single disciplinary note in any of the folders. That is the version of Benita Randle the agency would write about in its retirement letter someday. The other version, the one the federal indictment would describe, was already operating in parallel. The St. Louis Processing and Distribution Center on Eddy and Park Road is one of roughly 250 such facilities in the United States. The agency calls them P and DCs. The civilian world rarely sees the inside of one. They are not post offices in the way most people picture a post office. There are no clerks selling stamps, no P.O. boxes, no customer-facing counter. They are industrial buildings. Concrete tilt-up walls, 30-foot ceilings, dock doors running the length of one side, a fenced employee parking lot on the other, and a parking lot guard shack that nods you through after a glance at your badge. What happens inside them is the part of the postal system that the public never thinks about. Every piece of letter mail addressed to or from the greater St. Louis metropolitan area passes through the building on Eddy and Park. Tax refund envelopes from the IRS Service Center in Kansas City. Settlement checks from law firms in Clayton. Insurance disbursements from corporate offices in the suburbs. Personal checks dropped in a blue collection box outside a grocery store in Afton. Rent checks left for the carrier in the mailbox of a duplex in Tower Grove South. The mail comes in by truck, semi after semi backing up to the dock from before midnight until well past dawn, gets unloaded into wheeled containers, runs through the machines, and goes out again, sorted to the next zip code's carrier route. The volume is staggering. On an average weekday in 2023, the St. Louis P and DC processed approximately 4.2 million pieces of mail in a 24-hour cycle. The third shift, Benita Randle's shift, handled the heaviest portion of that. Most of the originating mail dropped during the previous day's pickups had to be sorted and dispatched before the morning trucks left for the carriers. The third shift was where the volume crested and where, on any given night, a single jam on a single machine could throw the entire region's morning delivery off by an hour. The supervisor's job on that shift was to keep the flow moving, to staff each machine, to rotate brakes, to clear jams, to resolve dispatch problems when a truck was late, to handle the small, constant emergencies of running a high-volume mail operation. A supervisor of distribution operations carried a master access badge that opened every door in the building: the platform, the operating floor, the manual sortation room, the registry cage where accountable mail was held, the empty equipment storage, the supervisor's office on the mezzanine, the break rooms, the locker rooms, the loading dock. The trust the system placed in that badge was absolute. A supervisor was not searched on the way out of the building. A supervisor's bag was not inspected. A supervisor could walk from the operating floor to her car at the end of a shift, carrying anything she wanted to carry, and no one would stop her. The internal controls existed. The Postal Inspection Service ran integrity tests. The regional managers conducted periodic floor walks. The cameras above the machines recorded everything. But the operating assumption was that a supervisor was, by definition, one of the people the controls were protecting against everyone else. A processing center, in other words, was not a vault. It was a sorting machine. It was built to move mail through quickly, not to hold it secure against the people running it. The cameras above the machines watched the machines. The badge logs recorded who entered which door, not what they carried out of it. The promise the system made to the public, that what you dropped in the box would reach the person whose name you wrote on the envelope, depended, in the end, on the integrity of the people who held the master badges. The investigation would later place the start of the scheme in early September of 2023. The evidence record does not establish a precise first date. The discovery worked backward from the recovered checks, not forward from a point of origin. But the deposit dates on the earliest cashed items and the postmarks on the envelopes recovered intact pointed to the first week of September as the beginning of the activity. By that time, Benita Randle had been a supervisor of distribution operations at the St. Louis P&D for 6 years. She had worked at the facility for 22 years total. She knew which machines ran which mail streams. She knew the rotation of clerks on the manual sortation cases. She knew when the registry cage was opened and when it was locked. She knew which dock doors were used for outgoing dispatch and which were used for receiving. She knew, more importantly, which corners of the operating floor were not in the camera angle of any overhead unit, and which were. The diversions, as the indictment would later describe them, did not happen on the machines. They happened in the manual sortation area. Mail too irregular for the automated sorters, oversized envelopes, mail with damaged addressing, certified envelopes that required hand processing, business mail with the kind of return address printing the optical character readers could not parse, was routed to a row of standing desks at the south end of the floor. Each desk was staffed by a clerk who keyed the mail into a separation case by zip code. A supervisor walked the line periodically. A supervisor could pick up a piece of mail and look at it. A supervisor could carry a piece of mail to another desk, or back to the supervisor's office for review, or into the registry cage for accountable processing, and no one on the floor would think anything of it. The pattern Randle developed was simple. She identified envelopes that, by their characteristics, were likely to contain checks, window envelopes from corporate senders, hand-addressed business envelopes with return addresses from law firms, insurance carriers, accounting offices, envelopes from the Internal Revenue Service Tax Processing Center in Kansas City, envelopes from the Missouri Department of Revenue in Jefferson City, envelopes from settlement administrators with the words claim number or case reference stenciled below the return address. 22 years on the operating floor had taught her how to read an envelope at a glance. She removed those envelopes from the mail stream on the manual sortation floor. She walked them, in small batches, to her supervisor's office on the mezzanine level. She placed them in a cloth tote bag she carried with her between her car and the building. At the end of her shift, she walked out the employee exit with the bag over her shoulder, swiped her badge against the time clock, and drove home. The cameras above the machines did not see the office. The cameras above the dock did not look toward the supervisor's stairs. The badge log recorded that she had exited the building at the end of her shift. It did not record what she had carried with her. The second half of the scheme, the part Randle could not perform herself, was handled by John Harrison. Harrison was 26 years old. He lived in Blackjack, a small municipality in North St. Louis County, in a one-bedroom apartment on a street of low brick fourplexes. The federal filings would describe him as the person who opened the envelopes and removed the payments inside. That is, Harrison sat on the receiving end of the diverted mail, opened the envelopes by hand at a kitchen table in the Blackjack apartment, sorted the checks by issuing bank, and either cashed them, deposited them, or transferred them onward through a small network of accounts that the investigation would later catalog in detail. The two-person structure was deliberate. Randle did not handle the checks once they left her car. Randle did not deposit anything. Randle did not appear on any bank's surveillance footage. Randle's role ended at the curb of the postal facility's employee lot, and the handoff to Harrison happened off-site, off-camera, and off-record. From there, Harrison's role began. The compartmentalization meant that if either of them were ever questioned by their own employer or their own bank, neither could be linked to the activity on the other side of the chain by any single document. Across September and October of 2023, 89 separate checks moved through that two-person pipeline. They came from the people and businesses you would expect to find in a regional mail flow. A small business in Maryland Heights, paying its quarterly federal tax obligation. An elderly couple in Webster Groves expecting a refund from the state. A widow in Florissant receiving a life insurance disbursement on a policy her husband had carried for 41 years. A construction subcontractor in South City expecting a final payment for a finished basement renovation. A young attorney in Clayton mailing a personal escrow check to a closing agent on a first home. The combined face value of those 89 checks was $369,248. The senders, in nearly every case, never knew the checks had been intercepted. They knew only that the payee never received the payment. They followed up. They called. They issued stop payments. They reissued the checks at their own expense. Some of them ate the loss directly. Some of them passed it on through their banks or their insurers or their accountants. None of them, in those first weeks, knew that the breakpoint had been a supervisor's office on the mezzanine level of a building they had never been inside. The lifestyle changes on Randle's side of the scheme were measured. She did not buy a new car. She did not move out of her bungalow. She did not appear, on the surface, to be living any differently than she had the year before. Whatever cash came back to her through Harrison was absorbed into ordinary expenses, bills, groceries, her daughter's school costs, the slow attrition of a single-income household carrying a mortgage on supervisor's pay. There was no flash. There was no spending pattern that would have triggered an automated alert at her bank. There was, from the outside of the scheme, nothing to see. That is the part of the scheme that made it sustainable. There was no audit anomaly. There was no clerk who saw something and reported it. There was no surveillance hit. From the inside of the postal system, the scheme did not look like anything at all. It looked like a Tuesday night. It looked like a Friday. It looked like every other shift the supervisor had worked for the last 6 years. The unraveling did not happen inside the post office. It happened on a residential street in North St. Louis County, sometime in the late autumn of 2023, when a tow truck arrived to take possession of a vehicle on which the loan had gone past due. The vehicle belonged to John Harrison. The lion holder, a subprime auto lender that financed the original purchase, had been carrying the account in delinquency for several months. The standard repossession procedure followed. A recovery agent located the car parked at the curb outside Harrison's apartment, hooked it up before sunrise, towed it to a holding lot off Lewis and Clark Boulevard, and notified the lender that the unit was in possession. At the holding lot, the standard post-repossession process included an inventory of personal property left inside the vehicle. The agent or lot worker would walk through the cabin, document anything of value, bag it for the lien holder to return to the registered owner, and note any items that did not appear to belong to the vehicle's registered party. What that walkthrough found was not the usual collection of fast food cups, jumper cables, and forgotten clothing. It found checks, a stack of checks, loose envelopes that had already been opened along the top edge with a thumbnail or a letter opener. Some of the checks were still inside torn envelopes. Some had been removed and stacked separately on the passenger seat. The names on the payee lines were not the name on the vehicle registration. The dollar amounts varied, a few $100s on some, several thousand on others, 1 or 2 in 5 figures. The return addresses on the envelopes included corporate senders, law firms, and government agencies. None of the envelopes matched the apartment address of the registered owner. The lot worker did what any reasonable person in that position would do. He called the police. A patrol officer from the local department responded inside the hour. He looked at the items in the car. He photographed them in place on the passenger seat and the floorboard. He bagged them as evidence. He noted the registered owner's name. He filed an incident report and forwarded the items with the report to the federal authority with jurisdiction over interfered with mail, the United States Postal Inspection Service. The Postal Inspection Service is the law enforcement arm of the Postal Service. It is one of the oldest federal law enforcement agencies in the country and one of the smallest. Its agents, called postal inspectors, never agents in their own jargon, investigate mail theft, mail fraud, and crimes against postal employees. A complaint involving recovered stolen mail in St. Louis was assigned to inspectors based out of the Eastern District of Missouri Field Office. The inspectors did what postal inspectors do. They cataloged each recovered check. They contacted each named payee. They confirmed, in case after case, that the payee had never received the payment. They traced the envelopes by postmark and routing characteristics back through the postal chain. The mail had moved through the St. Louis Processing and Distribution Center. The pattern of the recovered envelopes, most of them with similar characteristics, most of them likely candidates for hand sortation rather than machine processing, pointed to the manual sortation area of the third shift. That was where John Harrison stopped being the only name in the file. That was where the investigators began asking who, on the third shift, had walked the manual sortation line during the date range that matched the postmarks of the recovered checks. That was where Benita Randle's name first appeared on a federal investigative document. Not as a witness, not as a person of interest in the abstract, but as a supervisor with the access, the opportunity, and the badge log to match the timing of the intercepts. A tow truck, an unpaid car loan, a stack of envelopes in a car that should not have had them. The smoking gun was not a forensic audit. It was not surveillance footage. It was not an internal whistleblower. It was a repossession on a Tuesday morning, on a quiet street in Blackjack, over a delinquent note on a sedan with a worn driver's seat and a chipped rear bumper. We are heading into the trial side of this one now. If you want to see exactly how the federal system handled this, stick with me and hit subscribe if you have not already. This channel covers cases like this every week, and we do not let them get buried. The inspectors approached the case from both ends at once. On Harrison's side, the path was direct. The checks had been recovered inside a car registered to him. The names on the envelopes did not match his. The bank records, once subpoenaed, would show a pattern of deposits and cash withdrawals that aligned with the check totals. He was the easier defendant to build a case against because the physical evidence had been recovered from his vehicle and the financial evidence sat in his own account history. On Randle's side, the investigators had to work backward through the postal system itself. They pulled the badge access logs for the St. Louis P and D.C. for September and October of 2023. They cross-referenced the dates and approximate intercept windows of the recovered checks against the supervisors who had been on duty during those windows. The third shift supervisor schedule for the relevant nights produced a short list. Randle was on it every time. They pulled the security camera footage that did exist. The cameras above the manual sortation area showed her walking the line on the relevant shifts, which by itself proved nothing, because walking the manual sortation line was her job. What the footage also showed, on multiple nights across the date range, was Randle picking pieces of mail off the cases, examining them, and carrying them off camera in the direction of the supervisor's office on the mezzanine. There were no cameras inside that office. There were no cameras on the staircase to it. The footage ended at the threshold and resumed only when she returned to the floor, empty-handed. The inspectors interviewed clerks who had worked the manual sortation cases on the relevant shifts. The interviews produced corroborating but not conclusive observations. One clerk recalled that Randle would sometimes pick up envelopes for what she called supervisor review, but that the clerk had never been told what the review consisted of, or seen those particular envelopes returned to the line. Another recalled that there had been a period in the early fall when the third shift mail count out of the manual sortation area appeared lower than the count moving into it. A small discrepancy that had been raised informally with Randle, and that she had attributed to misroutes that would resolve themselves downstream by the following dispatch. The bank records pulled on Harrison's accounts produced the clearest single piece of evidence on the financial side. The deposits in those accounts and the cashed checks routed through them included items that matched the named payees of the checks recovered from the car. The total face value of the matched items, combined with the items recovered intact, came to $369,248 across 89 separate checks. The phone records pulled on both subjects, once probable cause was established, produced the relational link that the camera footage and the badge logs alone could not. Randle and Harrison had been in regular telephone contact during the relevant period. The call pattern intensified on the dates that matched the postmarks of recovered envelopes. Outbound calls from Randle's phone to Harrison's, often in the early morning hours immediately following the end of her third shift, with call durations short enough to be a check-in rather than a conversation. The pattern was not, on its own, proof of a scheme, but it was a pattern. The smoking gun on the Randle side was not a single document. It was the convergence of three records: the badge log, the camera footage of her removing mail from the sortation line, and the phone log tying her to Harrison in the hours after each shift on which interceptions had occurred, layered against the 89 recovered checks and layered against Harrison's bank records on the other side of the chain. The package was complete. The federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Missouri brought it to a grand jury. The grand jury returned an indictment. The federal arrest did not happen on the operating floor of the processing center. Postal inspectors do not, as a rule, walk into a building full of employees and pull a supervisor off the floor in front of her clerks. The notification was handled in the supervisor's office on the mezzanine, between shift change and the start of the next operational meeting. 2 postal inspectors arrived at the office at approximately 7:45 in the morning. The third shift had just ended. Randle was at her desk completing the shift report. The plant manager had been notified in advance and was present in the adjoining office. The inspectors closed the door behind them. "Ms. Randle, I am a postal inspector with the Eastern District of Missouri Field Office. We have a federal indictment for theft of mail by a postal employee. We need you to come with us." "An indictment for what?" "Theft of mail by a postal employee. The conduct is documented between September and October of last year. There is an arrest warrant. You will need to surrender your badge and your master key ring to your manager before we leave the building." "I want to call my attorney. You will have that opportunity at the federal building. Right now, we need you to stand up and place your hands on the desk." She stood up. She placed her hands flat on the desk on either side of the unfinished shift report. She did not argue. She did not deny. She did not ask what evidence they had. She did not ask who else was named in the indictment. She removed her master badge from the lanyard around her neck and placed it on the desk next to the shift report. She removed the master key ring from her belt clip and placed it next to the badge. The plant manager, who had been waiting in the next office, walked in to collect the badge and the keys. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Randle did not look at him. The inspectors escorted her down the staircase from the mezzanine, across the back of the operating floor, and out the employee exit. The third shift had cleared the building. The first shift was just arriving. A handful of clerks at the front of the building watched her walk out, flanked by two men in dark windbreakers. None of them said anything either. By the time the morning shift's operational meeting started at 9, the supervisor's office on the mezzanine was empty, and the door was locked. The case was prosecuted in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri in the Thomas F. Eagleton Federal Courthouse on Market Street in downtown St. Louis. A building Benita Randle had passed on the bus 1,000 times, and inside of which she had taken the Postal hiring exam 23 years earlier in a basement testing room, 2 floors beneath the courtrooms where her case would now be heard. The indictment charged her with 1 count of theft of mail by a postal employee, in violation of Title 18 of the United States Code. The same indictment charged John Harrison of Blackjack, Missouri, with 1 count of possession of stolen mail. Each count carried a statutory maximum of 5 years in federal prison, a fine of up to $250,000, or both. The face value of the recovered and matched checks, $369,248, would be used to calculate the loss amount under the federal sentencing guidelines. Harrison's case moved faster than Randle's. He was represented by an assistant federal public defender. He waived a preliminary hearing. He entered a guilty plea in February to possession of stolen mail. His plea agreement acknowledged his role as the person who opened the envelopes, removed the checks, and processed the payments through the accounts the investigation had cataloged. His sentencing was scheduled for the following June. Randle's case moved on a longer track. She retained private counsel. Her attorney filed the standard early motions for discovery, for production of grand jury materials, for suppression of certain evidence that the defense argued had been gathered without proper foundation. Most of the motions were denied or held in abeyance. By late spring, with the government's case largely intact and the corroborating evidence stacked against her on multiple fronts, the badge logs, the manual sortation camera footage, the phone records, the bank records on Harrison's side, and Harrison's own plea agreement, which the government would have been free to introduce at any trial. The defense did what the defense in cases like this almost always does. It negotiated. Randle entered a guilty plea in U.S. District Court in St. Louis to 1 count of theft of mail by a postal employee. The plea agreement acknowledged the conduct, that she had used her position as a supervisor at the St. Louis Processing and Distribution Center to divert mail containing checks, that she had handed those checks to a co-defendant who opened the envelopes and removed the payments, and that the combined face value of the checks involved totaled $369,248 across 89 items. The plea preserved the statutory maximum exposure of 5 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Sentencing was scheduled for August the 20th. The Postal Service, by the time of the plea, had already separated her from federal employment. The bungalow on Wabata Avenue went into a forced sale to address restitution obligations. Her daughter, by then in her late teens, moved in with Randle's sister Tamika on the south side and finished her last year of high school out of a back bedroom in an apartment above the salon. The retirement Randle had been 22 years into building, the federal pension, the thrift savings plan contributions, the health benefits she had paid into since her 20th birthday, collapsed into the consequence column of the plea agreement, line item by line item. At sentencing, the judge addressed her directly from the bench. The judge noted that the case was not, on the financial side, the largest mail theft the court had seen, but that the position from which it had been committed gave the conduct a particular gravity. The judge observed that the postal system depended, more than most federal systems, on the integrity of the people running it from the inside. That a supervisor's badge was a trust extended on the assumption that the holder would protect the mail, not skim from it. That the 89 checks involved represented 89 senders who had relied on the system to do its single, basic job. And a supervisor who had used her access to defeat that reliance, on her own shift, on her own floor, with her own master badge. The court imposed a sentence within the federal guideline range, calculated against the loss amount and her acceptance of responsibility, with restitution in the full amount of the loss owed jointly and severally with the co-defendant, followed by a period of supervised release. She was processed into federal custody. The St. Louis Processing and Distribution Center on Eddy and Park Road continued running its third shift the same night she reported to the designated facility. Mail moved through the building at 4 million pieces a day. The manual sortation cases at the south end of the floor were staffed by a new rotation of clerks, walked by a new rotation of supervisors. The cameras above the machines watched the machines. The badge logs recorded who entered which door. The system that had failed to catch her continued running on the same assumption it had always run on, that the people holding the master badges were the people the system was protecting, not the people it needed protection from. The promise the Postal Service makes to the public is a small one, that what you drop in the mail reaches the person whose name you wrote on the envelope. 89 times, across 2 months of 2023, that promise broke at the same point. A supervisor's office on a mezzanine level, in a building most of the senders had never seen. The break was found by accident. The break was paid for in years. This case was steady, but the case on the right-hand side of your screen right now is on a different scale entirely. Click it.